the International Climate Change Talks, COP26, where nations of the world will meet to discuss how best to deal with the challenge of climate change. Minister Barbara Creecy is coming to brief the nation and also talk to our international partners and all the different stakeholders about the work that South Africa has been doing as we prepare ourselves for COP26. Minister?
Good morning to everybody, and thank you very much for joining us here this morning. With just over a week to go before the start of the 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is taking place in Glasgow, I thought it pertinent to share with you today South Africa's expectations and also some recent news we have received from the Climate Investments Fund. The most recent governing body meeting of the Climate Investments Fund made a decision to invite South Africa, together with 3 other countries, to participate in the Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program. Accordingly, we have been asked to develop an investment plan commensurate to an indicative allocation of between $200 and $500 from the Clean Technology Fund. This allocation includes a $1 million investment plan preparation grant so we can develop the plan. Based on previous experience, and our department has worked with the CIF before, we envisage that this initial amount can leverage additional blended finance from one of the multilateral development banks with a multiplier of 3 or 4 to 1. Our government is in the process of setting up a high-powered finance workstream focusing on our just transition, which will develop this investment plan. We see the decision by the CIF as a small but crucially important first step towards laying the foundation work for the broader financing program of our just transition. The focus of this investment plan will be the Eskom energy transition, including repowering and repurposing a retired coal plant and investment in new low-carbon generation capacity. We hope to use the informal side of the meetings that take place at COP26 to generate further interest in supporting our country's just transition to a low-carbon economy and climate-resilient society. Ladies and gentlemen, our country goes to Glasgow with a clear mandate to negotiate for the full implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, including global goals on mitigation, adaptation, and support for developing countries to avoid the worst impacts of climate change on our people and on the environment. The recently released Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report tells us that in order to limit the impacts of climate change, the international community will need to collectively halve global emissions by 2030 and achieve global net zero by 2050, while strongly reducing other greenhouse gas emissions. Our country, as a signatory to the Paris Agreement, re-emphasizes its firm commitment to contributing our best effort toward the global cause of addressing climate change, not only have we significantly increased the ambition of our mitigation targets, but we have also brought forward the year in which emissions are due to decline from 2035 in the initial NDC to 2025 in the updated NDC. The country's mitigation target range for 2030 has been updated, placing the top of the range of our revised NDC in line with the Paris Agreement's temperature limit of well below 2 degrees, and the bottom of the range with the 1.5 degree temperature limit. South Africa will, in Glasgow, be encouraging all parties to submit their updated NDCs as soon as possible. We will also be encouraging countries who have not yet done so to voluntarily submit their low emissions development strategies under Article 4.19. Our country submitted our low emissions development strategy to the UNFCCC in November 2020, and this strategy outlines our mid-century aspiration to achieve a low emissions economy and a climate resilient society. Developing countries generally, and South Africa in particular, cannot implement ambitious mitigation targets unless there is sustainable, cost-effective financing from the developed countries and other multilateral and philanthropic institutions. Furthermore, a transition to a low emissions economy and a climate resilient society must be based on just principles. The well-being of workers and communities in the transition is an absolute non-negotiable. Vulnerable workers and communities across the globe who bear no direct responsibility for the historical accumulation of carbon emissions must be protected against transition risks and benefit from the opportunities presented by this transition so that no one is left behind. Although countries have committed to open and transparent discussions and have shown a willingness to achieve success at COP26, the greatest challenge is expected to be finance issues, where huge differences still exist between developed and developing countries on the finance required for developing and least developed countries to meet the challenges posed by climate change. One of the elements of the Paris Agreement is Article 2.1c, which requires all parties to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. What is striking is that we have as yet no common global understanding or guidelines to implement Article 2.1c. These issues, together with the future of long-term climate finance deliberations under the Convention, will be the make or break of COP26, as was the case in Madrid at COP25 in 2019. Accordingly, COP26 must re-establish trust between developed and developing nations by ensuring existing financial commitments are honored. Equally important is to start the process for determining a new and more ambitious post-2025 finance mobilization goal from developed countries for developing countries from a floor of $100 billion per annum. At the ministerial meeting hosted by the COP president in the United Kingdom in July this year, South Africa suggested that climate finance should reach $750 billion US dollars per year from 2030. Interestingly, this week, the BlackRock Investment Institute estimated in its latest publication that emerging markets which are starved of capital to successfully transition to net zero will need at least $1 trillion US dollars per year to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This, they argue, is more than 6 times the current investment. According to the report, a much larger amount of public money needs to be directed from countries that can afford it to those whose green transition is critical but underfunded, given the collective interest in a successful transition and a shrinking window of time in which to act. The public sector contribution will, the report argues, assist in de-risking investment by the private sector in emerging market transitions. Our country will therefore join others on the continent in calling for a common definition of climate finance and accounting modalities, as well as realistic, predictable, and ambitious support, which is equally balanced between financing for mitigation and adaptation. Climate finance instruments must include the right mix of grants, concessional loans, and private investment that does not exacerbate or contribute to the existing debt of developing countries. South Africa is among the many vulnerable developing countries that are already experiencing the impact of climate change in our daily lives. This is evident from the increased frequency of extreme weather conditions such as floods, droughts, heat waves, and all of these things threaten lives, livelihoods, food security, and of course, built infrastructure. It is crucial for South Africa and for Africa as a whole to see the adaptation issue treated in a balanced manner at COP26 and to be on the agenda in Glasgow and to be implemented thereafter. Adaptation and loss and damage are central to the multilateral climate regime, both under the Convention and under its Paris Agreement. Outcome at COP26 on adaptation that will enable practical progress, including the launching of a formal work program to implement the global goal on adaptation. In July, we suggested a potential way of quantifying the global goal on adaptation, namely to increase the adaptive ability and resilience of the global population to the adverse impacts of climate change, pardon me, by at least 50% by 2030 and by at least 90% by 2050. My apologies. This would require focus to be placed on the most vulnerable people and communities in Africa, small island states, and least developed countries. This must focus on health and well-being, food and water security, infrastructure and the built environment, and ecosystems and ecosystem services. Work on voluntary carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement needs to be completed. This should prioritize securing a share of proceeds for predictable financing for adaptation. South Africa sees a share of proceeds on both Article 6.4 and internationally transferred mitigation outcomes under Article 6.2 as a predictable source of funding for adaptation, which would grow as carbon markets grow. In this regard, environment integrity is key. There must be no double counting of units. Another issue that requires long overdue resolution is the setting of common timeframes for nationally determined contributions. South Africa presently has a 5-year timeframe, which is in line with the Africa position of not locking in low ambition over a long period of time. In conclusion, we hope that the Glasgow outcome should be a package deal that advances the negotiations and all three aspects of the Paris Agreement, namely mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation for climate action. South Africa stands ready to play a constructive role for the success of COP26. I thank you.
Recording in progress.
Thanks, Minister. They will now take questions from members of the media. We have some of the reps from the Fourth Estate in Pretoria, but of course we, in line with the virtual platform that we're using, the hybrid one that is, we will also be taking questions via WhatsApp system as well as some of the texts that have been sent through. We'll start online. Irene, if you can lead us with the questions, if there are any.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I have received one question on the WhatsApp group from Natal Garrett asking, Natal says, this morning Groundup reported that wheat biocontrol mass rearing unit at the South African Sugarcane Research Institute has closed down due to the delay in funding from the Department of Forestry. Other research units are at risk of closure too. Can Minister Creecy please comment on what steps are being taken to rectify this situation? On Zoom, there is a question on Zoom. I see one question from Lamise Omaji from PIN24. Lamise is asking, which are the other countries participating at the Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program? Is the funding guaranteed, or does it depend on the investment plan developed? We also have a hand on Zoom. We also have a hand we have 5 hands actually on Zoom. So let me just allow them. So we are taking questions on Zoom. I will start with Gabriel. You may speak.
Hi, thank you so much. Gabrielle Steinhauser from the Wall Street Journal. So the amount the minister just mentioned under this accelerated facility and also the amounts that seem to be on the table for the broader transition financing plan appear to be quite a lot smaller than what the government says is actually needed to fund the transition, and that should come from international sources. Do you see this bridge being, this gap being bridged at Glasgow? And what do you actually expect to come out of the summit, like at the summit in these sort of meetings on the sidelines? Do you want a commitment with an actual number attached to what the overall funding for South Africa would amount to? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. Team, you may ask this question. Please introduce yourself and which media house you're coming from. Thanks.
Sure, yeah, hi, it's Tim Cox. I'm the chief correspondent for Reuters. I wanted to ask, because South Africa has another reason for accelerating its transition from coal power to renewable energy, which is the huge levels of air pollution in the parts of Mpumalanga where a lot of the electricity is generated. And I wondered if the Minister wouldn't mind just explaining to what extent this is a factor in the move to accelerate, and what is her thinking on the quickest way to resolve that air pollution. Also, one more question. There was a report about that air pollution 2 years ago that was produced by the CRIS, and it never came out. And I just wondered if there was a reason why it didn't come out. Thanks.
Okay, should I take more? Okay, I will go to you, Carol. Please introduce yourself and which media house you represent. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Carol Payton. I'm from the Business Day.
Sorry, Carol, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I have, right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you may ask your question.
Good, thank you. Carol Payton from the Business Day. Minister, could you please tell me, are the developing countries sort of negotiating as a bloc? And do we sort of fit into the category of developing countries? And then secondly, I'm not sure if I didn't get it in the statement, but what sort of figure are you looking at for adaptation? And what sort of figure are you looking at for mitigation? What would you like to see committed? And then thirdly, just in terms of the green transaction, the Just Energy Transaction that South Africa is trying to negotiate with the 4 countries that visited last month. Are you aiming to conclude something at Glasgow, before Glasgow? Do you think there's a possibility? How optimistic are you that you'll strike a deal? And given that the grant funding that's on the table has been below expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. We have 2 more hands on Zoom. Zedadele, I'll come to you. Please introduce yourself and which media house you're representing.
Good morning. Good morning. Am I clear? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. We're from the Woke Nation. We're a South African independent media group online. So we just wanted to find out from the minister pertaining to the grant funding, because the voluntary markets are split between mitigation and, as they would say, the preservation of our environment. So is the minister open to us, the private sector, engaging itself and actually making their own market? Because that's actually what's happening in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. We have the last hand from Clarence Creamer. You may speak.
Thanks very much, Minister. Just on the Just Energy Financing Facility, which will be canvassing with multilateral lending institutions on the sidelines of COP26, given that there's 3 tranches over a 15-year period, what would you be looking to raise in that first tranche? And when do you see it being operationalized? Secondly, who will lead those discussions from the South African government side? Because I imagine you would be very much focused on the main agenda at COP, which is focusing really on the big architecture and the big breakthroughs, whereas this is very country-specific. So who will lead those discussions? And how do you respond to the suggestion that the National Treasury is not keen or is reticent around taking on additional, or providing additional guarantees to Eskom as it takes on fresh, even concessional finance?
Thank you, Terence. Over to you, Chair.
Okay, we'll invite Minister to respond to questions that have been raised. Minister.
Thank you very much. Can I suggest that the question from Ground Up be submitted formally to you, Albie, and we give a proper reply, because I am aware that there are difficulties with regard to the financing of research that pertains both to budget cuts we have faced and to supply chain issues. But I would want to make sure that we have a proper response to that. So if we could just request Ground Up to submit that in writing. Ms. Omaji, I know that 2 of the 3 other countries are India and Indonesia. I don't remember which is the 3rd country at this stage. But if we can ask you, Albie, if you can just get that from Zahir. The indicative allocation, we've been given an indicative allocation letter around the 2 to 500 million US dollars. And essentially what they're saying is that this is the indicative amount available, and depending on the investment plan that you put on the table, we will see how much we give you. But we have had money from this fund before, and this would not be the first time that we have engaged in relations with the CIF, and they in fact have in the past built one of the wind farms for Eskom. So we see it as being a fairly reliable source when they do indicate that they are interested in supporting us. The question from the Wall Street Journal. Yes, we agree that what's on the table at the moment is small. And I think that what we have indicated is that in order that we can finance the transition, we need a mix of grant funding, concessional funding, and also obviously there would be private sector investment. I think that we are not expecting that at Glasgow anybody's going to be there with their checkbooks. But I think what's really important at Glasgow is a situation where in a very short space of time you're able to speak to many of the central persons who would be part of all matters relating to climate change, climate financing, and so on. So I think we would be using that opportunity in side meetings to engage, to be explaining the nature of the investment that we require, to be explaining some of the constraints that we have, and also to be talking about our own investment planning and our own project preparation. So I think that we do see that as an important opportunity. We're not naive. I think that part of what I spoke about is the difficulty that the developing world as a whole is facing in finding a situation where developed countries are honoring their spoken commitment with concrete means of implementation, be it finance or be it technological support. So we're not naive about the situation that we are going to face, but we believe that we have an important story to tell, and we have had indications that there is interest and appetite for South Africa's transition. What we have to ensure is that whatever institutional mechanisms we enter into in future take account of our sovereign debt situation, take account of the Eskom balance sheet, and do not further intensify some of the financial difficulties that we face as a country. And that's why we emphasize over and over that we're looking for the right mix, the right financing mix. Grants, concessional financing, and of course, private sector contributions. Tim, with regard to your question, yes, obviously one of the side effects of a transition away from coal is that we would see improvements in air quality in Mpumalanga and elsewhere. I think that we have on numerous times in face-to-face meetings with both Eskom and Sasol made it clear that we expect the minimum air quality standards to be implemented, and that we are not going to be giving exemptions on in a willy-nilly fashion going forward. I think that we understand that there are serious health challenges facing communities in those areas, and we also understand that it is absolutely imperative that we improve the quality of air. And clearly, SO2 emissions, which are a major byproduct from burning coal, can only really be effectively reduced either by introducing flue gas desulfurization projects, which have their own complexities because they require a lot of water to run, and of course they're also very expensive to implement. So that is really the choice that faces the big emitters. They must either introduce technology that will reduce the emissions, or they would need to look at accelerating their decommissioning program. I'm not sure which CSIR study you're referring to. I know that we engaged in 2 small studies in preparing the air quality management plans in the priority air quality areas. My understanding is that the one in the Vaal Triangle was made public, and the second one will be made public when we bring the air quality management plan into the public domain for public comment. But there might be another study that you're referring to that I'm not aware of. Carol, South Africa is part of the African group of negotiators. So we work together with the rest of the African continent when we go to the climate change negotiations and also to the biodiversity negotiations. We work with the continent. The position that we would be taking at COP26 is a position that would have been approved by CAHOSC, which is the African Union committee that is responsible for climate change. So we in a sense are part of that negotiating mandate. I think that with regard to adaptation, we would not at this stage have a figure that we would be able to put on the table. Last year we concluded and was approved by Cabinet the National Adaptation Strategy. That strategy has now been used to develop provincial and local government strategies on adaptation, and we are now in the process of looking at how we will incorporate those strategies in the IDPs of municipalities and obviously other budgetary mechanisms of provincial government. And I hope that in due course we would be able to quantify what we're talking about. Clearly here you are really dealing with slow onset events which would be taking place over the next 10 to 15 years. And so what we're looking to do is to mainstream budgeting for adaptation so that we can start to make our infrastructure more climate proof so that we can start to deal with issues of water shortages. And of course, in the coastal provinces, ultimately we've got to be dealing with the question of sea level rise. Let me say at the outset that we have placed a plan for the first phase of the just transition on the table. The bulk of the work on that plan has been done by Eskom, but there is also important feasibility work that is taking place around green hydrogen and also the introduction of electric vehicles. And that feasibility work will be in due course quantifying the kinds of investments that are required and the nature of the investments that are required in the green hydrogen space and in the electric vehicle space. We are looking for any countries or institutions that want to partner with us. So we've been approached by the climate envoys. We didn't deliberately seek out the climate envoys. We are happy to receive support from those 4 countries, but we are open to other countries, some of whom have already indicated to us that they would like to have further discussion on our thinking around the transition and who would also like to be in a position to contribute. So I think that we're not confining ourselves to the 4 countries that have approached us. We are in discussion with the European Union and many other countries who would be interested in supporting us. The question from the world nation, I think that what I've tried to explain is that what we're interested in as government is a particular mix of funding that obviously needs to include a grant component and needs to include a concessional component, but would also include private components. I suppose there are 2 issues here. The first question would be what the private sector would consider to be an adequate return on investment and whether we can afford that adequate return. But I think the other issue that we would want to emphasize is that while government is involved in this space, there will be transition taking place in 7 sectors of our economy. And while government would want to be supporting all 7 sectors and would be wanting to help all 7 sectors to mobilize financing, this doesn't preclude individual enterprises entering into arrangements with the private sector for their own transition processes. One of the reasons why we think it's very important for government to be involved is it relates to this issue that I spoke about in my introduction of climate justice. Technological change is something that happens every day in industry. And one of the things we know about technological change is that there will always be winners and losers. What we want to ensure is that as these technological changes to green technology happen in our country, they happen in a manner that helps us with some of the fundamental structural problems that we face in our economy. Problems of economic exclusion, problems of poverty, problems of inequality, and problems of unemployment. And we don't want we believe that there are opportunities for the green transition to assist us in solving some of these problems, because the issue of justice is very central to the way in which we are approaching the transition. So already we're doing a lot of work in Eskom socioeconomic studies, looking at the value chains in some of the towns where these transitions will take place, so that we understand which workers will be impacted on, which communities will be impacted on, And how are we going to create alternative economic opportunities and alternative livelihoods for these communities? Terence, I think that what I explained in my input is that under the Cabinet Committee that is working around the just transition, we are going to set up a high-powered finance work stream. And it's really that work stream, I think, that would be negotiating the specifics of the finances, because there's lots of issues involved here. There's the financial mix. There's the way in which we are going to ensure that we're not contributing to the debt burden of the country. There are questions of protection from exchange control risks. There are lots of complex questions here. So I wouldn't regard myself as having the appropriate qualifications to be negotiating those kinds of details. And I wouldn't also think that those kind of details, that the appropriate place to negotiate them would be at COP. I think what COP presents you with, as I said earlier, is the opportunity to meet many people in a short space of time who would have interest in these issues. And obviously from that process, you would then be in a position to follow up with the details around deal making if those kinds of things are on the table. So we have a team that accompanies me to COP, and obviously that team would be supporting me in setting up the necessary meetings and discussions. And as I said, we have this high-powered finance work stream that we're going to be setting up that would really be engaged in the details of the negotiations, so that we are sure that whatever we do has the support and the approval of National Treasury. I think that I'm not hearing National Treasury saying there is no possibility of engaging in these transactions. What I'm hearing National Treasury say is we have broader debt problems as a country. Eskom has a weak balance sheet, and the way in which we engage in these processes have to be responsible, and they have to take these things into account. And that's why we need this finance work stream that includes National Treasury. I think I have dealt with all the questions, Albie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister. We will open now for the last round of questions. I'm not sure if from Pretoria there is any, or we can go online and see who is raising questions. Irene, let's take questions.
Thanks, Chair. I will read questions from Zoom. I have 3 questions from Onke, from Daily Maverick. Onke is asking who will be representing South Africa in the negotiations at COP26, and how much of South Africa's just transition plan is based on the Meridian Just Transition Plan. And I'll also take a question from Suzanne Paxton. Suzanne is from SABC Radio News. She's asking the leader of the host nation. Okay, the next question from Suzanne from SABC Radio News. Suzanne is saying the leader of the host nation, British Prime Minister Johnson, said last month that it will be tough for developed countries to meet their financing pledge to developing countries. He gave it a 6 out of 10 chance to meet that. The Paris Agreement pledge was $100 billion a year to help developing countries. How are we as a developing country going to make sure that the goals and the pledges are reached so that we can reach our own goals? The next question question. Oh no, this is not a question. It's she has withdrawn. She has been responded. Thank you.
Okay. Those are the only ones, right?
For now.
For now, okay. Okay, Minister?
Onke, I will lead the South African delegation to COP, just like all other countries, where the environment ministers lead their delegations, their countries' delegations to COP. The South African, the Just Transition Plan that we're working on at the moment is the plan that has been developed by Eskom, and we are also working on plans that the ICT is developing in relation to green hydrogen and electric vehicles in partnership with the Department of Science and Technology. So those are the only plans that have status in the South African government. There are other people who have their own ideas, but those are not the official plans that we are working on as government. Suzanne, I guess that it's really up to all of us to negotiate hard for developing countries at COP26. As I said in my input, the issue of financing from developed countries to developing countries is going to be the make or break of COP26. It was the issue that led to the breakdown of talks at COP25 in Madrid in 2019. So I think that the citizens of the world are deeply concerned about climate change. All of us are already living through the realities of what climate change is going to mean for our own lives, for our countries, and more importantly, for our children and our grandchildren. What we know in South Africa is that unless we are able to stabilize global average temperature rises, the temperature in our country will rise at twice the global rate. We already know what it means. It means increased drought, it means increased storms, it means sea level rise, it means uncontrolled wildfires. So I suppose the ultimate pressure that is going to be put on the leadership of developed countries is the pressure of their own voters who are facing floods and wildfires, and the pressure of the citizens of the world who want to ensure that their children have a sustainable future and that they're able to live in a world where there is harmony with nature and safety, food security, ecosystem services, and health and welfare. So these are not small issues that are at stake, and I think we have already seen how the world's citizens are starting to organize and demand that these issues must be solved. The carbon gas emissions that we see in the world today are the result of 2 centuries of industrialization by developed countries. This is why the Paris Agreement places an obligation on developed countries to address this very dire situation that their industrialization and their prosperity has created. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister. I am told we have a few other questions that trickled in after we took the last round. Can we maybe use this as our last round? We will take those questions, Irene.
Thank you, Chair. The first question comes from Elise from Media 24. What is the relationship between Minister Creecy and Minister Mantashe? He keeps on giving approvals for coal mines and ship, as well as the drilling for oil and gas drilling in the sea. Does Minister Creecy not think South Africa should talk with one mouth? And the next question is from Sophia Christensen from AFP News Agency. Sophia is asking, what is South Africa's current plan for phasing out coal and coal subsidies? Can COP26 be inclusive considering COVID-related travel restrictions? Sophia is also asking, could you please expand on your proposed targets for climate change adaptations? The next question is from Maloba Teka. Maloba is asking, while the global trend is towards accelerated deployment of RE, is there a commensurate effort to ensure that the economic value derived in the development, construction, operations, and ownership of the project is done so as to continue national efforts towards economic development and distribution of wealth and economic opportunity? And I have the last question from Elaine. She didn't say which media house. Elaine is asking, please could Minister Creecy again cite the amount on the table that under the accelerated facility? Thanks. That's it for now.
Thank you. That was the last round. I'm not sure if there are any further questions from Pretoria.
I seem to have
Okay.
follow-up hands from Terence and Carol.
I think let's take them.
Okay. Terence, you may ask a follow-up question.
Thanks very much, Minister. Just on the work stream that's being set up for high level, could you say who's part of that work stream and whether it has already met or not? And secondly, just on the authorization of the financing facility, when do you want it operating by, and where will it be located? Will it be at the National Treasury, at BBSA, or at Eskom? Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. You may ask your follow-up question.
Thanks. Could you please clarify this facility that Lamise spoke about, this coal retirement facility? Is that a CIF facility? Is that completely separate to the just transition transaction you're talking about? And is that 200 to 500 million? Is that grant funding, or is that a loan? Thanks.
Okay. We fine?
Yes, Chair. That's it for now.
Okay. We're closing for questions. I'm not sure if there are any further questions. Minister will respond to the questions that have been raised, and then we'll wrap up on the other side.
Let me start with Elise's questions. Elise, Minister Mantashe is a cabinet colleague. That is our relationship. We work together in cabinet. And we work together on any task that is assigned to us to work on by the President, and that includes the issue of the energy transition. Coal mining and prospecting for gas are not outlawed in our country, and it is the role of the Department of Minerals and Energy to issue permits for prospecting and for extraction, and I have explained to you before that these matters are not outlawed in our country. At the moment, the plan. So let me explain to you. We have this mid-century aspiration of to reach net zero. Why do I call it an aspiration? Because at this point in time, we have not researched the 7 sectors of our economy in great detail so that we understand exactly how this entire transition process must be phased and sequenced over the next 30 years. That research is happening. At the moment, it's being coordinated by business, and in due course, it's going to be coordinated under the umbrella of the Climate Commission. And the 7 sectors of our economy that are vulnerable to the transition risk include mining, agriculture, petrochemicals, the transport sector, manufacturing, energy. I don't remember the other 2 at this stage. But the point is that each of these sectors is doing extensive work so that in the end we can say that we don't have a mid-century aspiration to be at net zero, we have a plan to reach net zero. And you would see that in many developed countries, they are starting to put plans on the table, costed, budgeted, implementation plans with timeframes. And that's ultimately where we want to move to. But you would understand that this is a massive process, and as I say, it's something that would be taking place over the next 30 years. Now, the question that you have to ask yourself when you have to eat an elephant is, where do you start? And we all know that you have to start with bite-sized chunks. So we have said that one of the places we want to start is with the energy transition. Why? Because all goods and services in the South African economy have energy as an input. What we know is that across the globe, developed countries and all of our major trading partners have made a mid-century commitment to net zero. The consequence of that is that we're already beginning to see potential trade barriers to goods and services produced in countries with high carbon footprints. So in a country such as ours, where 90% of your energy is generated by coal, all of your goods and services have a high carbon footprint. Even if the World Trade Organization doesn't implement carbon border tariffs, and I think as a country we would argue against that because we believe that it would be highly discriminatory in relation to developing countries. Even if that doesn't come about, we're finding that consumer choice and the decisions of financing institutions are moving away from goods and services as well as infrastructure that is produced with a high carbon footprint. So we understand that the climate change poses a transition risk to our economy. So we think that if we can reduce Eskom's carbon footprint, and we reduce thereby the carbon footprint of all of our goods and services, that is the good place to start to eat this elephant. What we also understand is that after energy generation, the second highest emitter is our transport sector. And that is why we are prioritizing this work around green hydrogen, because we believe that South Africa is in a unique position, both because of the vast amount of sunshine that we have, but also because of the intellectual property that a company such as Sasol has. We believe we are in a very unique position to start to produce a green liquid fuel. And as all countries in the world move into a green transition, a green liquid fuel is going to become of crucial importance. for the aviation industry, the shipping sector, and possibly also the trucking sector. So that is why our plans are starting with Eskom, with the green hydrogen, and also with electric vehicles, because we understand that vehicle manufacturing is a major job creator in our country. We know that the OEMs are already starting to look at where they will locate the manufacturing facilities for future electric vehicles, and we want to make sure that our automobile industry is not cut out of that equation. Now, in due course, we would have to look at the mining sector and issues such as coal mining. But this is not, there are no concrete plans on the table in relation to that at this stage. And I think that we would see that as being something that would come about later in the transition. In terms of targets on adaptation, you would understand that these things are geographic specific, because it really depends on the nature of the climate threat in different locations in our country. And that's why we've developed the national plan that looks at issues such as infrastructure, it looks at the built environment, it looks at water security, it looks at questions relating to agriculture, all being sectors that will have to adapt to the change in climate. But the actual implementation is going to have to happen at a provincial and a municipal level, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. So it wouldn't be intelligent for a city like Johannesburg to be dealing with sea level rise, whereas, of course, when you go to eThekwini, that would be a necessity. But a city such as Johannesburg is going to have to consider the issue of water security. Similarly, a city such as Cape Town is going to have to consider the issue of water security. The eastern part of our country has got to look at the fact that we're going to see an increase in tropical cyclones. And how are we going to weatherproof that infrastructure? So that's why I'm saying that this is work in progress, and it's very specific to different regions of the country. I think that the point that has been made about how will the accelerated deployment of renewable energy assist us with some of our broader economic objectives is central to this concept of justice. And what I was saying earlier is that unless this transition can help us to deal with fundamental questions such as economic inclusion, broadening the ownership base of industry in our country, developing new industries that will create new jobs, making sure that people such as women and youth who have been historically excluded and marginalized should be actively involved in these projects. These are all the issues that I was raising when I was talking about the issue of justice. And this is why you need a grant financing component. Because if you are going to make sure that you're also dealing with economic transformation issues, you have to have a revenue source for these programs that is not only based on hard numbers on return on investment. So that is, I think that is central to the way in which we are conceptualizing this issue, and all the work that we've been doing in Mpumalanga has really been focused on the question of how are you going to create new industries for new people under new ownership in these towns that might otherwise face difficulties. Just on the question of the amount of the CIF fund, the indicative amount is between $200 and $500 million, and it depends on the nature of the investment plan that we put on the table. And I also indicated that our previous experience of working with this fund is that we normally find that together with that grant financing, so that 200 to 500 million is grant financing, we normally find that it comes with an opportunity to borrow money at concessional rates from a development finance institution somewhere in the region of a multiplier of 3 or 4 to 1. Carol, the CIF it's an international institution, and it's an institution that a number of the development finance institutions use as a finance facility to relate to countries that they want to work in. Our finance facility would be a domestic facility that would be responsible for looking for financing for the transition as a whole. So this is CIF is a financing institution that's come to us and said, can we contribute? And this is what we're offering. But obviously we want to have a facility so that on the domestic side, we can organize ourselves properly and we can make sure that if there are finances that are raised through this process, they're going to the right place, there is appropriate accountability and transparency, and also I think that what we're saying in the international space is that we want to be able to pay for performance. Terence, we are in the process of setting this work stream up. It will involve people from Treasury, from ESCOM, from the Presidency, from our own department. We have a climate finance section. It will also involve colleagues from the ICT. We are looking at how it will be located so that it's not it's available to all of the partners that are working on this, and we will be making announcements on this shortly. Some of the colleagues are already operational and they're helping us in the discussion that we're having with a range of institutions on these matters. But once it is formally established, we will make that information available in the public domain. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how we come to the end of this briefing. As we, like we said earlier, prepare to join other nations of the world at the 26th Conference of Parties that will be hosted in Glasgow in the UK. Minister was here to brief the nation and through yourselves as members of the media on areas that we will be putting forward at the meeting. Thanks so much to colleagues at GCIS for having assisted us, and from the DFFE communications team. Thank you so much, Minister. Humble thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.